Welcome to episode 21 of the Fact Dev Lounge podcast, your DMNB podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gander, and today we welcome Pam Pastirik. She's the executive director and founder of MB Copes, a grieving support group for children and youth with loss in the community. And we welcome Pam to chat with us today. Welcome to the Fact Dev Lounge podcast. I'm Dr. Sarah Gander, your host for your podcast with Dalhousie Medicine, New Brunswick. Today, I'm honored to welcome a friend and a colleague, Pam Pastirik, who's the executive director of MB Copes and also a nurse in our community who does a lot of teaching. We're meeting today because we think that this is an opportune time to talk about a tragedy in our community recently with a loss of a friend and a colleague, but also a chance to just touch base and talk about some of the things that are going on at this time. So welcome, Pam. Thanks for coming today.
Thank you very much for having me.
I've been looking for a reason to have you on the podcast, and sadly, a tragedy is what brings us together today. Our community, as you know, lost one of our colleagues, Sohrab Lutchmedial, this week, tragically and unexpectedly. And while I didn't know Sohrab very well myself, I certainly remember his face and his smile and his hello in the hallway as something that really stood out to me. And so he will be greatly missed. And not only that, he had a huge impact in our community, faculty and research, and as part of the Heart Center. And so just a huge loss to the medical community as well. So I thought that might be a jumping off point for us to have a conversation today.
Mm-hmm. We are such a close-knit community, and when we lose somebody, we all experience grief and loss, and it's impactful on many different levels. And I know that, for example, my kids went to camp with Sohrab's kids. So, or they played hockey together, or, so, living in the small community that we have, we just know each other on different levels or through different associations. And it's such a ripple effect when you see someone that's so vibrant and has made such a big difference to our community in different and like just multifaceted ways, that we just find it's such a shock to think that someone so well is there one day and then they're not. And then what do we do? How does that impact us? How does it impact our work and our relationships and lots of things?
Well, and there's a few thoughts that I had just because this time is so weird with COVID and stuff and things. And you just sort of think none of us really see each other as often, like face to face as we did before. But yet when you're working acutely in the hospital, you still do that pass by of people, or you almost get excited to go into emerge to see a patient because then you can like walk around and chat with a few people.
Right.
and so like I think my last interaction with him was just sort of passing by in the emerge and being like, hey, and you're like, hey. And then and such a profound sense of loss with now knowing that, that brightness won't be there. And so I think our community felt very, and continues to feel very just down. We're feeling down, we're feeling so sad in that grief. But Pam, doctors aren't supposed to have those feelings, maybe. I don't know. We don't really allow ourselves the time to process.
Well, I think that, that is one of the things about healthcare people. We're always the ones that are supposed to be in control. We're in charge. We give, physicians in particular, they have a responsibility for giving bad news to people, for supporting people, for holding it together. And you know what? Who holds us together, or who holds you together when these kinds of things happen? So I think that healthcare people, physicians in particular, have a lot of responsibility on their shoulders to keep things together. And when a crisis of this magnitude happens, it's hard for them to process. And then probably their go-to response is, okay, hold it together, because that's what they're used to doing. But then if there's not an opportunity to validate your grief, then it can lead to very, you know, potentially, very harmful effects, I guess, if we don't process our grief. But even from a, smaller scale, it can impact our concentration, our relationships, because we have to have this idea that we have to carry on despite our feelings. So I think it's a really hard road to travel when you're used to being on the other end of helping people, giving them, not so good news, supporting them. And then all of a sudden, the tables are kind of turned and you've lost a colleague and you are grieving. And who's there to give you permission and to validate your lived experience of loss when you have to go and put a front on at work and carry on, especially people who would work very closely with someone in their workplace, and they still have to carry on and do the things day to day, and that person is not there, and they're missed by either, sometimes people in our workplace know us in different ways as friends, colleagues, confidants, and they're not there anymore, right?
Mm.
And how
There'd be so many triggers, to it and reminders. I mean, for good or for bad. In medicine, we've had a couple people just even like leave our department and move on to another place. And sometimes when I see their signature on a letter or in a chart or read one of their notes that's even from like when they were here and they're not here anymore, and you have that moment of pause of like, oh, and those are people who just like moved away that you could talk to if you wanted to. But I could just see this as being so challenging to kind of go back to the day to day, you know, and their presence would be so noted, on the regular.
and it can kind of be like um, they're present in their absence. It's like everyone
Yeah.
knows that that person's not here, but they're they're still,
But their orders
their
are here,
orders are
like,
here, their patients are here, their colleagues are, and so it's really hard, those triggers, and having to pull yourself together and can continue to do the good work that you need to do. So it's
mm,
just one of the hardest things. And it's also a disenfranchised loss. Sometimes we talk about different kinds of losses, and some are more validated than others. So let's say you lost a child to cancer, or you lost a child. It's more
mm,
validated. If you
mm,
lost a spouse, it's more validated, but there's certain types of losses, like a loss of a friend or loss of a colleague or a coworker, that doesn't give you the same degree of permission to grieve. So people feel,
mm,
I should be supporting someone else. I should be supporting Sohrab's family, and I shouldn't be feeling this, or I shouldn't be grieving. They don't give
mm.
themselves permission, and nor do other people either, right? Allow for that.
Well, no, I mean, I feel, very affected by what's happened, and I did not know Sorab very well. And a colleague of mine who I didn't know had any relationship with him, not that it's any of my business, was, visibly upset. And, my first thought, I'll call it an ingrained thought that I'm not proud of, is kind of like, well, you didn't even know him. Like, why are we so upset right now?
Hmm.
But quickly, my kind of more trauma informed part of my brain kicks in where I'm like, well, you don't know people's previous experience just in life, period, with loss, like you said. And who knows what your relationship is with people because it's not always going to be so obvious. And why wouldn't we be supporting each other?
Right. And this is a person that had
Mhm.
a lot of impact on our community and saved people and came up with new
Mm.
technologies. And, sometimes we grieve even people we don't know, we grieve for them and with them or with their family because we know what a tremendous loss. Or sometimes we say, that person was almost my age and they have children
Mm.
and they have a
Mm.
family and they're not able to be physically there. And, you know, what if that happened? Like, we just, as human beings, I think we we have empathy, and we place that on situations. We personalize it sometimes. And that's not wrong. That's just grief. That's just how we are. Is deep empathy, really, is what it is.
Well, I don't think we can underemphasize in societally, which I said doctors before, but I would argue healthcare
Mhm.
provision or even maybe societally, we've decided that outward emotion or outward grief or is uncomfortable and not accepted socially. So, push it down, pack it down, get over it, get through it. You know, I feel like you and I couldn't talk about that enough to
Mhm.
the audience to say, like, we need to change to a place that we open that processing of emotion. We are there for each other, that we allow it to happen.
Mhm.
Because what's the alternative? We pack it down, we move on. If there's one thing I've heard in the grief world, in my experience, is that grief will wait for you.
Mhm.
And I don't know if that's something that with your work
I would
you
concur
talk
with
to people
that. I
about.
mean, that's so interesting way of framing grief, because it will wait for you if you don't process and accept it. And, we had this wonderful family that came to one of the retreats at MB Copes, and he said, you almost have to befriend it, he said. He said, you have to befriend your grief, and you have to say, okay, this is what it is. It's here with me. I'm carrying it on my journey. And it's not something that I can push down, because if I do that, it's going to get heavier actually. It's going to get a lot
Yeah.
heavier if we can't unpack it and validate it for each other, and give
Mm.
compassion and space to each other to be, talk about that lived experience, talk about that sorrow, talk about how difficult it is to go to work not knowing that that person is there beside you, that you worked with intimately on a day-to-day basis helping people. I mean, to not be
Mm.
able to express that is is painful. It's very
Mm.
painful.
Well, and that grief is going to be a part of you now. Your
Mhm.
loss is part of you now. And so if you're going to, I don't know, I don't think you can hate yourself through difficult emotion. Like if you're gonna self-care, if you're gonna self-love, then you have to love that part of you too, even though it's not what you wanted.
Mhm. And one of the things that I learned, and our with MB Coats, we did some training through the Dougie Center. It's an internationally
Mm.
known training center. Lots of people in Canada have gone there for this work. Um, but I learned a lot about grieving styles too, because
Oh.
there are different grieving styles, and some people, just because they're not talking about it, it doesn't mean they're not processing. Just because they're not
Mm.
crying, it doesn't mean that they're not sad. They just have different ways. And one of them, which I kind of thought was quite funny because I know some people like this, and they were called
Mhm.
blueberries. So these blueberries, that's a typology, is don't hug them, don't touch them, like, they get rigid when you hug them. Thank you
Oh.
very much. And, but the,
I'm a hugger,
yeah,
so
see, I'm
that
not.
is
I'm like a
definitely
broccoli. I think that's, or an eggplant or whatever. There was four of them. So I thought
one.
this was really interesting because it gave me a different perspective. And the ability to accept a range of responses to grief and loss and not expect something of either myself or somebody else to process grief in a certain way. So I think people need to process their grief in a way that they see fit. And what's
Hmm.
most important is that they acknowledge it, they validate it, and they don't push it down, like you said. But do it in
Hmm.
a way, like some people get really, really busy, like a hamster on a wheel. Like,
Hmm.
that's how they process grief. Other people
Right.
may retreat and be very withdrawn. That's how they process grief. I mean, I think it's hard in healthcare because we're faced with death and these things every day. It's not like we can go somewhere else and get away from it. And I think that's what makes it particularly hard for healthcare workers to process grief because
Hmm.
we're triggered by virtue of the work that we do every single day. There's no, it's almost like you need to build in self-care opportunities to be able to process the heavy things, including grief or the loss of a colleague in your day to day, week to week, whatever kind of work you do. If you can connect around this in a purposeful way, I think that's really important because we'll tend to
Well,
not pay attention to it or carry
yeah.
on, like you said.
Like that's the ultimate self-care is to give yourself that hold space for yourself to do that work, because I think self-care gets a lot of, buzz, but
Right.
it's more than just like going to the spa or like,
Hmm.
these sort of treats that we give ourselves in the name of self-care, but that self-care is truly like allowing that time. And it just makes me think because I've been trying to do so much work with my own brain on this, and
Hmm.
then the New Brunswick Medical Society is so committed to wellness
Hmm.
strategies right now, which is wonderful given the strain and stress currently on healthcare. But last night I was watching Christmas Chronicles with my boys,
Hmm.
and immediately I start crying, like anything holiday related. I have tears in my eyes the whole time.
Yes.
It's pretty pathetic.
Well,
So I'm a crier too. And so like Eddie, my 9-year-old, was like, "Oh God, mom's crying again." And he says, "Why do you cry so much in movies?" And I was like, "Honey, mommy sees terrible, sad things all day long. So my tears need to come out at some point, and so I have reserved them for holiday movies."
exactly. And you found a way to express. And it may not be, it's not connected like to that movie. It's connected to the care, how
No.
you carry grief with you through your lived experience of helping patients and holding all that trauma and those stories
Yeah.
with you. And you have
Right.
insight so you can connect it, right? You can say this isn't really about Rudolph being excluded and all that.
I
Poor
will cry.
Rudolph.
Yes. I will cry about anything that has any sadness or any beauty in a holiday movie, but it serves
Yes.
me much better than eating
Yeah.
donuts and drinking red wine on a Tuesday.
Right,
So,
right, exactly. There's a time and a place. So I think, though, what you're saying is so important because we may find that when we lose people in our workplace environment that we're going to feel different emotions and maybe even display different behaviors that we're not quite sure why. We might be more irritable, snappy, we might be just off. And people
hmm,
will notice, most likely, people that know you, but people you work with. You might feel like you can't have a clear head. You might have
hmm,
worry about errors and things because it's just that your brain gets a little bit scrambled when you have this grief put on you. There's such a
hmm,
thing medically as having this fog and things like that. So I think importantly is to be aware that these feelings and behaviors and things can emerge in our workplace as manifestations of grief, but we just might not see
Mm.
it that way. We might not have it's like the subconscious, like we just might not see it or think
Yeah,
it.
like, why do I feel off? Why do I,
Yeah, or
like,
why can't I get it
well, some
together?
people don't wanna go to the work at the best of
Yeah.
times right now because it's, like, the worst of times, it feels, but,
Well, this is the thing is
that extra.
burden, that extra heaviness, and then to top it all off, we've got work, shortages, we've got COVID, we've got many, many things that are causing stress. So if you add
Kids
something,
at
kids
home,
at
learning
home,
online again.
learning online, being a teacher, and then trying to be full time,
Yeah.
health professional, and all of those things. But I think in cases where you lose a colleague, it's really important to do something purposeful to get the community together, which I'm sure will come out in the days moving forward
Mhm.
around how can we honor and remember that person. That will happen. But often it's the grief couple months down the road that is the hardest to
Mhm.
deal with. It's not
Yeah, my
like
mom used to say, like, when the finger sandwiches have long gone stale and the cards stop coming is that feeling of being more alone.
exactly. Your mother's a very wise woman. I know her. Very smart woman.
Yes, she is wonderful.
That is so true. Is that, and then what
Mm,
happens is we place that on ourselves because society tells us that, you know what? Bring the sandwiches and the cookies and the cakes and be present and then go to the funeral and the rituals and all those things and then it's done.
yeah,
But really, for
so
most
it's
people
like,
that are
okay.
grieving a loss, it's starting. It's probably not starting till a few months later until the fog lifts and sort of that shock. And especially with sudden loss. When you have a
Mm,
sudden loss, there's no preparation. It's like an insult. It's like an insult to your brain. You just don't
it's a
know. It's
trauma.
a trauma. You don't know what's up or down. And you have to reframe, reorganize your brain, all of that to be able to come to terms with what's happened to you. And that
Mm,
takes a lot of work and insight as well, and self
mm,
compassion, and people
right.
around you that are going to validate that grief doesn't go away. It's carried for the most part. And depending on the nature of the relationship or the depth of the relationship, it's lifelong.
You said at one point about how when you notice things that, like, even if you didn't know the person, you acknowledge that they were, like, close to your age or
Mhm.
perhaps have a similar life than you because, of course, we all feel like nothing could ever happen to us or that
Mhm.
we kind of still have that immortal sort of feeling, but, is there, dare I say, a moment of not a silver lining per se, but just sort of this moment of appreciation of life, humbling, let's call it, maybe that's the word. I feel humbled by Sohrab leaving us because I think, oh my gosh, I don't know how old he was, but
Who's 52?
he's 52. Okay, so I will say on the air that he's 10 years older than me. So he's 10 years older than me, has these beautiful children in university. You know, it's humbling. It's makes you feel vulnerable, but makes you want to live every day, I guess.
Yeah, I was just looking at something because I wanted to bring it up on my phone, because I often put things up. And the one quote that I put up recently is that the trouble is you think you have time. And
Mm,
it's Buddha, so it's Buddhist. So I think, to your point, we think we have all this time because we feel sometimes we're protected from these things. It doesn't happen to us, it happens to somebody else. And we'll always have time to do that, or we'll do this then, or we'll do that, you know. And the reality when someone dies that is so vibrant and young and has, had such vitality, I guess, and
Yeah.
dies, then you realize, you know what? We don't have time. And can happen. And how do we use that experience or absorb that experience in our own lives to appreciate the time that we really have in the moment?
Hmm.
So I wonder, with these sudden losses, it really brings into focus that we are just here for the time that we are, and we don't have any. Most people, I shouldn't say most, but some people have a prediction, or maybe they know their life limitations, I guess, but or not. We don't know. We don't
Yeah.
always know those things.
It's such a hard time right now too because people don't feel like they can travel the same way or like have the experiences or adventures or sort of like capture their bucket list the way they'd like to in these times. But I heard the other day this thing about it was about money management, and it was looking at if you wrote down the top 5 things that meant the most to you and then you looked at your credit card bill and looked at the top 5 things you spend money on, for most people, those just don't match. So you're buying your Amazon, whatever, you're doing your whatever, but really your top 5 list is your kids or maybe your parents or maybe your health or whatever. And maybe that this time is a has a gift to it that is reconnecting with what is your true priority, um, and giving us the space to process some of the things that we need to process. So then all of a sudden we aren't searching for the donut or the Amazon package or the whatever, the false thing that's going to maybe make us feel better. Um,
I know we've
yeah.
been kind of thrust into that through COVID. It's really
Mm.
complicated a lot of situations around grief and loss too, because you know people can't do the same things that they used to do. Just like you said, people can't travel, but sometimes we have to travel for rituals and funerals and to be able to
Mhm.
see people that we love that we haven't been able to see in a long time. And I think, that's created a host of other grief. Like right now, I think in our society, grief can be from loss, but there's a lot of grief around our loss of being able to live our lives fully. So when we talk
Oh,
about
or like see, I still have grandparents that I haven't seen in weeks.
exactly, and your children, like that's really important connection for you, for your
Mhm.
kids. So, and that is time. We talk about, okay, we only have now. Well, if we only have now and all this is interfering with us being able to connect with people and do, then there is a sense of grief and loss associated with that period of time that COVID has kind of robbed from us. You
Yeah.
know, I have a family member that's terminal. And you know what? If COVID didn't exist, we would have done many other things and done the things that we
Mm.
needed to do together. But it's interrupted that. But we've had to
Mm.
also reframe that and kind of go back to what you said about the sort of the fundamental important things in life and putting them in priority as well, right?
Mhm.
So, I mean, there's been a lot of grief, right? There's been a lot of grief everywhere um, because of COVID, and then all the changes that are associated with it. And then people are suffering mental health impact. And then what if you have a loss on top of that? Like a physical loss of
Yeah.
a person.
So you're not even at your, I don't know, best, if you will, or
Hmm.
like strong, like you're already
Well,
vulnerable.
COVID's kind of worn everybody down, right? It's kind like COVID's kind of
Mhm.
worn everybody down in terms of resilience. So the resilience that we had to face these kinds of things, tragedies, losses, we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable right now.
But I guess I kind of feel like the title of this podcast is hopefully something along the lines of why it's okay to feel and allow those feelings to come, and to
Mm-hmm.
maybe not to have the fear. Do you guys like, is it fear too that makes people resistant of processing some things because they just think it'll be too
Yeah.
overwhelming? It's just too much.
I think sometimes it's like everyone's individual, right? First off and foremost. But I think it's around the Pandora's box thing too. If you open it up and you let it all out, is
Mm.
it going to make it worse? Like some people have said to me, I can't go there because if
Mm.
I go there, I can't come back. I'm going to feel worse. Well, I would say most people that express their grief and go there feel much better having done so.
Pam, tell us about MB Copes.
Oh, NB Coast. Let me tell you about NB Coast. So, NB Coast is a nonprofit. We should have charity status very shortly, so that will be exciting. The work emerged from I was a director of Camp Carey Society, which is a BC based organization. And I went there with my family. We went to a retreat, and I came home and I said, we need to have these resources here for our community. It became kind of part of my healing, but part of my vocation, I guess, in terms of getting this work done. And so in 2019, just before COVID hit, we decided that it would be better to have a grassroots initiative here so that we could engage more people and have a local board and all of that. So we developed NB Copes. And luckily, the people that were working locally with Camp Carey were really excited about MB Copes. And so we have a really strong team, a lot of motivated people and volunteers. And we just had a family retreat at Snyder Mountain. So we do intensive family center retreats for children and youth and their parents. And we help them with expressive arts and music therapy, recreational therapy, things that are known to be very helpful for children and youth in particular. So we are developing programs in the community as well. To support children and youth, we've had a couple of partnerships with UNB, and we actually had a publication from that partnership, which was great. And we had a partnership with the Boys and Girls Club of St. John and the Charlotte Street Arts Center in Fredericton. So I think we recognize that there's a need for support for children and youth. We focus exclusively on that population because they are the most impacted, I would say, by grief and loss because of their developmental age and stage, and having to move through life for such a long period of time too, carrying that grief, like carrying that
Yeah,
with them.
children and youth who have lost a sibling or a parent
Yes.
or some or another significant.
Yeah, it's usually a
Yes.
sibling or a parent. Having said that, you know more than I do, but families are very unique. They are not
Mhm.
something to be put in a box and say, okay, it's a sibling, it's a parent, it's a father, because families are much bigger and more complex than that. So I think it
Mhm.
really depends on the nature of the relationship that people have with that person and their ability to cope. So usually people come to us when they're struggling with coping. And they've had significant losses, often traumatic loss. I would say 75% of the people that come to MB Copes have had sudden loss, which is interesting
Mm.
because they've had no preparation. They're just kind of, or a very short time frame of an illness. Not to say that we don't have families that come from more anticipatory grief and things, but it just seems that those families have been shell shocked and they're kind of looking for some
Mhm.
hope and some healing for themselves and children.
And we'll put your website in the show notes, but it's mbcopes.com. And so you can find out more information about the programs that you have. And
Absolutely.
yeah. And then I'll also put the MBMS wellness contact in the show notes too, just because that's a resource for faculty if they need some counseling or support or just want to reach out to have someone hold some space for them.
Hmm.
Pam, thank you so much for coming today. I wanted to bring your wisdom and just, well, general loveliness and compassion to our faculty, and open up the conversation for people, give people permission to feel and have conversations about this, sadly because of our loss, but
And I
ongoing.
wanted to say that there are some very good resources. I mean, we're still in development because we're sort of early on in our development as a nonprofit, but Canadian Virtual Hospice has some very good resources. There are videos, there are different things that the Dougie Center as well has a lot,
Mhm.
especially when working with children and youth. But there are some,
Mhm.
through Canadian Virtual Hospital has adult-based grief support as well. And the UK has, and Australia, UK and Australia have very outstanding resources on grief and loss. They're quite ahead, I would say, of Canada and the US, even like UK and Australia. So I would say
Mhm.
reach out to some of those as well, but more importantly, look after each other, support each
Mhm.
other, validate your grief, do something special together that is going to allow you to honor your colleague and their life, and don't pack it away. Recognize that it's going to be kind of ongoing, especially if you work closely together. It's going to be an ongoing process of reconnecting around your grief. So, and take care. And, you know, I'm sorry, very sorry for your loss.
Oh, thank you very much for that. And thanks again for coming today.
Okay, we'll talk soon. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you
Thanks,
for your great
Pam.
work.
Oh, thank you.
Have a good day. Take care.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Fact Dev Lounge podcast. Please leave us a review on iTunes, YouTube, or SoundCloud, and even a comment on some ideas for future podcasts. Thank you very much and have a great day.